Good evening. To begin with, whenever the subject touches Russia, directly or indirectly, a historical residue still lingers in the collective mind. Namely that unless he who deals with the subject does not emphatically declare that he is not or has never been a communist sympathizer, he is implicitly or suspiciously assumed or suspected to be a crypto-communist or something like that. In fact, I am not, nor I have ever been one such suspect, and if I had been one, I would not have any difficulty in declaring it. So this is the end of prelude. Now, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity. And from this point of view, Gorbachev's life is no different. However, men who visibly walked on the stage of history offer great opportunities for expert pundits, historians, biographers, chroniclers, storytellers, blabbers, and certified politicians to pass certified judgment and certified sentences on the life of the men in question. But even common men who do not ride the tide of pomp that beats upon the high shores of the world can form their own judgment. Many unconscious slaves of power slavishly believe the tales that power tells them through television. Others form their conclusions through perceptions and judgments cast on specific episodes singled out and rated as telling or significant perceptions, often linked to personal emotions. And we know that one's emotional reactions to an event varies inversely with one's knowledge of the facts involved, or, more simply, the less we know, the more wrong may be our related reaction. Often they, or we, are unaware of the immediate or associated context and background surrounding an event, which, if considered, may cast a different light on the whole story, the story of which the event is part of. Furthermore, and inevitably, we see others through the glasses of our own experience. The question then arises whether, by setting aside our first impressions, our judgments may change. And to such strain of common men, I do belong. This issue has puzzled many throughout history. Pascal, for example, with convincing reasoning, has consumed that tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, meaning to understand everything is to forgive everything. Pascal's conclusions, however, while true, is not practical. For example, advocates of extreme neoliberalism have summarized the principle as follows: the fortunate must not be restrained in the exercise of tyranny over the unfortunate. Whereas people of opposite opinions maintain, for example, that all current social problems of America are the result of slavery, leading, of course, to defunding the police, turning many cities into veritable war zones, and so on. With Gorbachev, if we examine his life in the context of Russian history, and perhaps in the context of the Russian soul at large, our judgment may change. To claim knowledge of the Russian soul without being Russian smacks of hilarious bragging. However, while precise knowledge of the soul of a people, or for the matter of any country, is inherently impossible, approximations and limited generalization are, I think, acceptable, if accompanied by a genuine interest at large in that country's history, literature, and art. To this extent, adventurous readers may verify my interest and limited claim to limited knowledge of the Russian history and culture by referring to the videos, each one of which is about 30 minutes long, I produced on the subject, specifically the history of Ukraine in 6 episodes, the life of Stalin in 5 episodes, the schism of 10,005 AD in 2 episodes, the essence of Marxism in 4 episodes, and the historical roots of Russian communism in 3 episodes. Even so, I only claim interest, not expertise, and what I attempt here is not a biographical summary, but a perception of Mr. Gorbachev and of some of his actions as observed by an outsider, someone sometimes referred to as the common man. Furthermore, besides the interest that led to producing the videos I just mentioned, I will add a few notes about my limited but direct experience of Soviet Russia, which occurred at the end of my teens, during my first life as a, believe it or not, as a country singing guitarist in Crimea. And it took place during a kind of little-known pre-Gorbachev glasnost, as he called it. Knowing then extremely little of Russian history, my feelings were similar to those of the English poet Wordsworth, who visited France at the beginning of the French Revolution. And with few minor changes I could apply to Crimea what Wordsworth said of France. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times when everything took at once the attraction of a country in romance. Of course, I had little knowledge of the Bolshevik Revolution, the famines, the gulags, Solzhenitsyn, the horrors of World War II, and of Russian history at large. My next experience was in Moscow, which I visited a few times while employed by a US company as their international marketing manager. My task was to demonstrate equipment at an international exhibition, leading to contracts with the Russian government organization that supervised, structured, and managed foreign trade. By that time, I had begun to read in earnest some of the Russian classics, and, however randomly, I tried to find in personal transactions some of the spirit or the descriptions found in the novels. For example, my colleagues and I were lodged at the Ukraina Hotel, a classical example of Russian Stalinesque architecture, imposing, but, in my view, elegant in its massiveness. My room was on the 8th floor, and metal gates blocked off all stairs. Therefore, in the morning, when all guests simultaneously tried to descend, the waiting time was long, and waiting for a free elevator, that is. On my 3rd day, I took the liberty of approaching the hotel manager, naively suggesting that the stairs could be opened and made available to the guest. And he replied that it was impossible. But I said, "What happens if there is a fire?" And he replied, "We have no fires." And while the reply was amusing, it was almost a transposition in real life of what some literary character could have said in similar circumstances, as found, for example, in Turgenev, Dostoevsky in his short story called The Crocodile, or Gogol in his novel Dead Souls. Yet the bureaucracy that the West accused Russia of reflects, in my view, a historical need for structure, independently of the ideology behind the structure, my impression. But I digress. As we can glean from many reports and interpretations, Gorbachev attempted to unwind the intricate web of Soviet government infrastructure, an infrastructure linked to a Byzantine, more than Marxist in my view, a Byzantine perception of government. In fact, the main meaning of Byzantine has to do with administrative intricacy and bureaucracy. Now, some historians have even determined that the first Bolshevik was the Emperor Peter the Great, inspirer and author, among other things, of the famous Table of Ranks in 1722, which is a long list of detailed structured military and government positions and associated job description. Peter the Great even condemned his son to death. And for a historical parallel, during World War II, Stalin's son fell prisoner to the Germans, and they wanted to exchange him with General von Paulus, who had been captured and defeated at Stalingrad. Stalin is said to have replied, "We do not exchange soldiers for generals." With glasnost and perestroika, which we can succinctly translate as openness and reform, Gorbachev attempted to change the Soviet machinery of government and possibly its inherently associated mode of thought, view of the world, if you like, or even, perhaps, philosophy at large. His efforts, in my view, compare with the plan by Diocletians to reorganize the Roman Empire in 286 AD, splitting it into two sub-empires, which then became four, and the whole reorganization ending eventually with Byzantium, meaning Constantinople, becoming the actual capital of the Roman Empire in 395 AD. Often, many causes are the parent of one event. With Diocletian, one particular cause was the growing influence of the East, but equally, Rome had become increasingly difficult to govern, a process which began much earlier with Emperor Caligula, famous for having made his horse a senator. Now, chroniclers of the time and various subsequent historians said that Caligula was mad. According to others, however, he only wanted to show and emphasize that the Roman Senate had become so corrupt and dysfunctional that even a horse as a senator would be a notable improvement. A latter-day Caligula would retire Biden, in my opinion, and exchange some of his cabinet members with horses, leading to an improved economy, peace, restoring international standing, and reclaiming common sense as a guideline of policy. A process extendable at large to, if I may, in my opinion, to the European Union's members of an unelected European junta who believe themselves to be magnificently grandiose while being actually inelegantly little. In this context, it is regrettable that the US and increasingly Western education at large considers history and literature as the idle pastimes of fools who are stupid enough to apply their interest to anything else but making money. Because I am translating and quoting an Italian intellectual here, Salvatore Bravo, from an article titled Russian Literature and Us. He says, literature favors the disposition towards finding and understanding political and meaningful ties in history. Its abandonment has countless consequences, and it is the spy of the identity crisis affecting Europe. One cannot cultivate bonds and establish relationships with the world without touching the dark depth of the human being. In the darkness of an inner conflict, man finds his own light. He asks questions to find metaphysical foundations without which any existence is unbearable. Without a metaphysical foundation, the human being lives the tragedy of an ego that thinks he can do anything and is apparently omnipotent. But in reality, the ego unravels in the despair of its loneliness, reaching at times to extreme gestures. For murder and suicide are two faces of a despair that finds no meaning in life and no reason to turn towards hope. Following this line of thought, the current banning of Russian classics, music, and art by various European government and educational institutions are platitudinous instances of ignorance with a capital I. An ignorance that is the night of the mind, but it's a night without moon or stars. However, the general issue of not understanding Russia has a somewhat curious history, a history of its own. And it starts perhaps with Dostoevsky, who in 1873 writes in his diary, "In days gone by, I understand nothing," meant merely ignorance on the part of him who said them. Yet at present they bring great honor. One has only to declare it with an open air and snobbishly, "I do not understand religion, I understand nothing in Russia, I understand nothing in art," and at once he is lifted to lofty heights, and this is all the more advantageous if one in fact understands nothing. Notorious, Notorious is Churchill's sentence on the subject, "Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." Nevertheless, one possible key to understanding is to read, or read again slowly, at least some literature classics of the 19th century or even of the 20th century. For example, Dr. Zhivago, I mean the book, not the Hollywood movie. Reading and rereading them, at least in part. And if at the end of your reading you may feel different in a way that you cannot even explain very well to yourself, you may have then acquired an inside inkling or realization of the difference between the collective Western and the collective Eastern mind, of which Russia is the archetype. And it doesn't matter, I think, if that feeling cannot be easily conveyed in words. But returning to Mr. Gorbachev, one generally overlooked event in recent Russian history occurred in 1991 with the referendum, when the peoples of the republics were asked if they wanted to retain the geographical unity of the Soviet Union under a new and different regime. The general elections were held on March 17, 1991, in the various republics that made up the USSR. And the question on the vote was, do you consider necessary the preservation of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic in which the rights and freedom of an individual of any ethnicity will be fully guaranteed? Armenia, Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania and Moldova boycotted the referendum. In the other 9 republics, turnout was 80%, and the referendum's question was approved by the majority of those with the right to vote. In Ukraine, for example, out of 37 million with the right to vote and with voter participation at 84%, over 22 million voted to preserve the Union, which corresponds to 72% of the actual vote. Belarus had similar results, 87%, and in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, about 93% of the voters voted to retain the Union. In Azerbaijan, the percentage in favor was 75%. Nevertheless, in December 1991, Russia, Belarus and Ukraine signed a treaty of disintegration. And incidentally, the US did not recognize the results of the referendum, of course. The question arose then and is still unanswered. What about the will of the people, of democracy, of elections? In August 1991, on the eve of the approval of the referendum results, a coup d'etat occurred organized by the State Committee for the Emergency Situation. Following which, as we know, came Gorbachev's resignation in December of the same year. In the context of this compressed analysis, I think that the last section of Gorbachev's resignation speech is memorable, and not only for the impact of that essentially forced decision, but for its aftermath. And here are Gorbachev's last statements from the December 1991 proclamations. We have become one of the key strongholds in terms of restructuring modern civilization on a peaceful democratic basis. The nations and the people of this country have acquired the right to freely choose their format for self-determination. Their search for democratic reform of this multinational state has led us to the point where we were about to sign a new union treaty. All this change has taken a lot of strain and took place in the context of fierce struggle against the background of increasing resistance by the reactionary forces, both the party and state structures, and the economic elite, as well as our habits, ideological bias, and so forth. The change ran up against our intolerance, a low level of political culture, and fear of change. The old system fell apart even before the new system began to work. The crisis of society, as a result, aggravated even further. I am aware that there is popular resentment as a result of today's grave situation. I note that authority at all levels and myself are being subjected to harsh criticism. I would like to stress once again, though, that the cardinal change in so vast a country, given its heritage, could not have been carried out without difficulties, shock and pain. The August coup brought the overall crisis to the limit. The most dangerous thing about this crisis is the collapse of statehood. I am concerned about the fact that the people in this country are ceasing to become citizens of a great power, and the consequences may be difficult for all of us to deal with. I consider it vitally important to preserve the democratic achievements that have been attained in the last few years. I'm very much concerned as I'm leaving this post. However, I also have feelings of hope and faith in you, your wisdom and force of spirit. We are heirs of a great civilization, and it now depends on all and everyone whether or not this civilization will make a comeback to a new and decent living today. I would like, from the bottom of my heart, to thank everyone who has stood by me throughout these years, working for the righteous and good cause. Of course, there were mistakes made that could have been avoided, and many of the things we did could have been done better. But I am positive that sooner or later, someday, our common efforts will bear fruit and our nations will live in a prosperous, democratic society." Unquote. On balance, we could perhaps say that Gorbachev, once engaged in a process logically simple in appearance, found it very difficult to effect that which it was logical to suppose effected, particularly when hungry and greedy wolves around him were ready to jump on the political carcass of Bolshevism. On the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the coup, Gorbachev declared that the event constituted the violation of the will of the whole people, which, frankly, it flagrantly was. And, as Gorbachev himself said, he had lost authority, and too many who were communist until the day before fell into the grasp of greed and saw opportunities of enriching themselves in the ensuing turmoil. Which explained, by the way, the surging of so many oligarchs almost overnight, not to count the massive inflow of experts from American universities and banks, who came to teach Russians the meaning of life, how to live and how to steal, and who aptly applied their large snout to the large trough left open by the August coup, with the direct consequences that we know of, at least for the Russian people at large. In certain aspects of his political life, we may perhaps see in Gorbachev echoes of Prince Mishkin, the protagonist of one of Dostoevsky's famous novels, especially in an apparent willingness by Gorbachev to believe the sincerity of the American establishment and deep state, whose policy, not to say perfidy, reached remarkable extremes worldwide when freed, at least temporarily, from the fear of Russian military retaliation. In the West, what helped to create the impression of Gorbachev as a somewhat ambiguous individual were his long, intricate sentences to express simple ideas. Considering that, as per the English poet Alexander Pope, words are like leaves, and where they most abound, much fruit of sense beneath is rarely found. Perhaps, with his long verbal elaborations, Gorbachev was trying to convince his Western counterparts that glasnost and perestroika were the result of deep and elaborate thought. But the effect at large was probably marginal when not counterproductive. In my view, Gorbachev reached the proverbial bottom of the public relation pit when he posed as an emblematic promoter of the Pizza Hut chain in Moscow, and by inference a promoter of all the other US fast food joints and chains and franchises that jumped at the Russian opportunity. Establishments, in my view, whose menu and fare many retain as great contributors to the epidemic of degenerative diseases in America, as if the only way to eat cheaply were to eat destructively. Besides, the gesture could not fail but be interpreted, however unintentionally, as a symbolic wholesale endorsement of Western values and, by inference, of neoliberal, rapacious capitalism, of which The coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 ended up being but one later emblematic manifestation. With Victoria Noodle or Noodleman and her train, a despicable creature not worth the dust that the rude wind blows in her face. Finally, and as we know, Gorbachev had a great bond, love, spiritual affinity and partnership with his wife Raisa, who also, by his admission, much influenced his thought and actions. On the 10th anniversary of her death in 2009, Gorbachev recorded and sang a song in her memory and honor. The title of the song was Old Letters, which also shows that Gorbachev, by the way, had a good country voice. At a charity in London, he went on stage to sing Old Letters, but halfway through the song he burst into tears, could not continue, and left the stage, accompanied by an extended and spontaneous applause. You can find the link or look in the internet for the song Old Letters. All in all, I think we can perhaps salute Gorbachev, in the same way that Horatio said goodbye to Hamlet. Good night, Mikhail Gorbachev, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may all the number of the stars give light to your fairway. Good night.